Welcome back to the fifth episode of our series Cost Management, How to Build Your Financial Model. Today will be our first part of the forecast and budget, how to plan your contribution margin. So for better understanding, it's highly recommended to watch our first four episodes. Also to watch our series about Excel for FP and cost management.
Now, let's first discuss what's the contribution margin and how can we forecast it. As you can see, in its simplest way, this is how the contribution margin is calculated. It's company gross sales or total revenue less all its variable cost or VC.
But how can contribution margin be calculated? I need a practical example from a manufacturing industry if possible. Don't worry, I'll show you practical examples from the building material industry. But let's first discuss what's the contribution margin. Are the contribution margin and gross margin the same concept?
In one of her articles, Ona Labes stated that gross margin is not contribution margin. Ona said the gross margin is the sales price of a product or service, less all direct costs of the product or service expressed as a percentage of sales. It is used to understand the percentage of revenue generated to cover the operating expenses of the business. So, as you see the formula of calculating the gross margin as follow. Gross margin equal the gross profit divided by revenue. In other words, revenue minus COGS divided by revenue. On the other hand, Ona stated that the contribution margin, CM, is the sales price of a product or service, less all its variable costs. It represents the incremental profit per unit earned on the sale after covering variable costs, direct materials, direct labor, and variable overhead.
Another expert, Mr. Sufyan Hamid, has discussed this topic as well. He stated that
the biggest challenge in contribution margin, in my view, is to be able to assign a unit value to fixed costs. I have in mind channels costs, for example the rent of a store, the salary of the salespeople, and so on. I know some people consider them as indirect costs, but in a service industry, they can be the majority of costs.
Now, would you like a summary as final thoughts about the main differences? Here you are, a good article by Preetha Banerjee and reviewed by Dheeraj Vaidya.
In her article Contribution Margin, CM, vs Gross Margin, GM, by Preetha, that also reviewed by Dheeraj Vaidya. You will read a good discussion about the main differences. The best sections are Contribution Margin versus Gross Margin infographics. But take care, the gross margin should be in the left side of the infographic, and the contribution margin should be in the right side. The image is not correct. In the next comparative table, Preetha also tried to discuss the difference in meaning of the two concepts. The importance, the formula used, the difference in terms of profitability metric, and so on.
Then a final two important section by Preetha is the final thought section. In the upcoming episodes I will try to discuss this further with practical examples. So, now we've a revenue or gross sales and variable cost. But what is the variable cost? We need a practical example.
Variable cost is an expense that will vary or change based on how much a company produces or sells. It will increase as production increases and falls as production decreases. The following table summarizes the key differences. For example, variable costs are changed or varies with both the production quantity and the sales quantity. But on the other hand, will remain constant per production unit.
Do you want to know some examples of variable costs? Let's discuss the most common variable costs in the building material industry.
In general, the most common examples are labor, direct power cost, and raw materials. And in the building material industry could be the following: raw material and additives or auxiliary, consumables, electrical power and fuels, cost of emission rights shortfalls, mineral charges, packaging material, other costs of materials, third-party production services, other variable cost, change in stock.
But how to calculate the variable cost? And how to link it to both the fixed costs and total costs?
In one of the articles published on the HubSpot blog about variable cost explained in 200 words, Braden Becker explained what the variable cost is. Then he discussed the main variable cost components in more detail. Also, he referred to the variable cost formula as follows. Total variable costs equal the cost per unit multiplied by the total number of units. Also, he described how to calculate the average variable cost in case of multi-products calculation. Also, how to calculate the average fixed cost, use the formula in this image. And finally, how to calculate variable cost ratio, using this formula. By dividing the variable costs by net sales.
Don't worry, all these formulas and more will be explained in detail in the next episodes. But let's first see now a short illustrative example.
As you see, we've a cost analysis of product type F. The product components include the following variable costs. Half a unit of measurement of raw material type A, the unit price of this material is 910. Also, 1/3 unit of measurement of additive material type B, the unit price of this material is almost 42. 1/2 unit measure of electrical power and fuels. Let's say the power cost per one produced unit is 54. And so on. As you see, by multiplying each unit of measurement by its unit price, we'll get the cost per ton. In other words, the cost per one production unit. On the other hand, we've the following monthly fixed costs. But take care, the total fixed costs will remain constant regardless the produced quantity. For example, total monthly salaries and depreciation are fixed regardless of whether you have produced or not. Let's now increase and decrease the total production quantity. As you see, when you increase the total production quantity, the following will happen. The variable cost per unit will remain constant without change. But the total variable cost will be increasing. On contrast, the fixed cost per unit will decrease. But the total fixed cost will not change.
Did you get it? Don't worry, in the next episodes we'll discuss further examples. But now, it seems that variable costs are matter in decision-making process, but how?
In one of his articles, at the Library on CFO University, Dr. Mark Stiving discussed the effects of margins, variable costs and overheads in pricing and P&L. He discussed important questions, such as variable costs. Do they matter in pricing? And what exactly is the role of variable costs when it comes to pricing? He concluded that it depends on if you are able to set a different price for every customer or not. Also, Dr. Mark discussed another important subject, such as determining the role of variable costs, how fixed costs and variable costs relate to pricing, and so on.
Really, it's very important article by Mr. Mark and the CFO University. You'll find the link of this article on the comments. And I'll try to discuss this article with practical examples in one episode of this series. Now, why is contribution margin important to management? Why they need to calculate it? In other words, why contribution margin matter?
In one of his articles, Mr. Luis Talavera has discussed this question. Why contribution margin matter? He stated that as organizations manage the challenge of increasing costs, measuring contribution margin on products and services can be vital to maintaining profitability. In his article, he featured a good example of the contribution margin by linking it to a practical case about burned house. Then he concluded that the contribution margin is the amount of profit or the water needed for the burned house that each unit, bucket, contributes towards paying recurring fixed expenses, putting out the fire. Finally, he concluded that measuring contribution margin should not be a sporadic exercise, but rather should be done on a recurring basis, especially when inflation is looming around.
Back again to our short illustrative example. What are the variable cost rate and fixed cost rate? And how can calculate it? Is the variable cost ratio same as variable cost rate, or they are different? All these questions will lead to another important questions. For example,
how can the average contribution margin for several products be calculated? What is contribution margin income statement? What does the contribution margin tell you? What is the best contribution margin ratio? How do you optimize contribution margin? And how to control both your variable and fixed costs? We will try to discuss all these questions and more with many practical illustrative examples in the next episodes.
But for better understanding, it's recommending reading this important post by James Rimmer. Especially two parts.
The first part that discuss how to calculate the overhead rate. And the second part, about comparing your overheads to your sales. Both methods using similar methodology of calculating the variable cost rate and the variable cost ratio. Also, by reading this post and other posts by James Rimmer, you will be able to maximize your gross profit and minimize your overheads.
So again, prepare yourself to the next episodes. Also, watch the next 2 episodes on the second series about Excel for FP&A. It will be about scenarios analysis and the sum product function. See you in the next video.